In this presentation, we're going to be talking about depth of field. Now, depth of field is a term used to describe what appears to be in focus and what's out of focus within our pictures. And there are certain settings that we can use to be able to increase the amount of things that are sharp within the picture or decrease the amount of sharpness within the pictures. Sometimes we hear the term bokeh, which is kind of referring to the same thing, talking about kind of the circles of light, or sometimes more technically known as circles of confusion in the background that we may see within our photographs. So again, depth of field is talking about the area of acceptable focus within our pictures. So in general, what we're doing is choosing a particular point to focus on, and then depending on the settings within the camera and how we're photographing, we will see a certain amount of distance in front of our subject and behind our subject that appears to be acceptably sharp. And that term acceptably sharp is always kind of a little vague because each of us may have a little bit different interpretation of what would be considered sharp or not. But in the slide you can see here that our point of focus is in the middle of the trees, and then the depth of field is basically how much in front of the subject and behind the subject appears to be sharp within the picture. And those things outside of that range would appear to be out of focus. So here's another example or diagram that shows how that affects that focus. And in the example here, you can see where the best focus point is within the picture. There is a certain amount of depth of field in front of and behind the subject. And then things that are really close to the camera or really far away appear to be out of focus. And we can change that range using some different variables in our camera to be able to increase or decrease the amount of depth of field in our photographs. You'll also notice that where the best focus point is about 1/3 of the way behind the front edge and 2/3 away from the back edge. And general rule of thumb is for depth of field is if you focus on a certain point, basically about 1/3 of the distance in front and 2/3 of the distance behind will appear to be sharp if it's in that range of the depth of field. So here's in the depth of field the three variables that will affect how our photographs will change in that depth of field. The first one is the aperture, and the aperture is our primary way that we see the change in the depth of field of our photographs. The second way is the distance to the focal plane of focus within the pictures. In other words, how far away is our subject away from the camera when we're taking the pictures. The closer it is to the camera, the less the depth of field is going to be. The further away it is, the more depth of field there's going to be. And the third one is the focal length of the lens. We haven't really talked too much about focal length of lens, but basically understand that the wider angle the lens, the greater the depth of field you're going to have in your photographs. The more telephoto your lens is, the less depth of field you're going to have at the same aperture when you're taking your photographs. So here's the first variable, talking about aperture. When we change the f-stop in our camera, or the aperture, we're changing the size of the opening within the lens. And in general, the smaller the opening is, the greater the depth of field is going to be. Okay, so if you're shooting at f/16, you're going to have more things sharp within the pictures than you will if you're shooting at 5.6. Okay, so if you're wanting to make sure that the background is out of focus in a photograph, you're generally going to want to use a wider open aperture like 5.6 or 4, or in some cases, in some of our camera lenses, it may be like f2 or f1.4 to be able to achieve that shallow depth of field where only a small portion of our subject is sharp in the pictures. Okay. Now, in some cases, we may want to have more things sharp. So, for instance, if we're doing landscape photography where we want the whole vista in the foreground to be sharp in the picture, we may want to use that smaller aperture like f/16. If we're doing something maybe where we're taking pictures really, really close up, and we're finding that, again, one of the variables talking about how close you are to the subject, but you're finding that the depth of field is really small, you may have to use that f/16 to be able to try to increase that amount of focus within the pictures. So here's an example in a photograph that we can see the change in the depth of field of this book. And in the photograph, you can see that at f2.8, which is a wider open aperture, there is only a small portion of the text that's really clear and readable in the picture. Whereas at f8, on the right half of the picture, we can see that there's a greater amount of the text that's clear and easy to read within the pictures. That's our depth of field. Shallow depth of field on the left, greater depth of field on the right. Here's another example using the clock and the flowers here. So the first one we can see is a wider open aperture at f2. We see that the clock is pretty sharp in the picture. We see that the flowers in the background are out of focus. The foreground is out of focus. You see the ruler, and you can see that only a small portion of the ruler is sharp in the picture. Same thing in the middle, f8, we can see that there's more things sharp. You can see the little basket that's behind is a bit sharper overall in the picture. And then at f16, the smaller aperture, then we see a greater amount of depth of field within the picture here. More things are sharp overall in the photo. One last example here so we can see. Here's a photograph of a lady standing out in a field with the red flowers, and you have the mountains in the background here. Again, smaller aperture f22. We see more depth of field, greater depth of field. Sometimes we call it deep depth of field. Whereas at f2.8 on the right hand side, we can see that only a small portion of the picture has some sharpness to it. And there are some benefits for doing this because in some cases we may be doing like some outdoor portraits and we want to make the background where it's more blurry behind so that it's not as noticeable in the pictures. And in those cases we may want to use that wider open aperture to get a shallower depth of field in the photos. So let's go on here to variable number 2, the plane of focus. Okay? In this case what we're talking about is how close our subject is to the camera itself when we're taking a picture. Okay? The further away the subject is, the more the apparent depth of field there is within the picture. Okay? At the same f-stop. The closer the subject is, the shallower the depth of field is going to appear with the camera. Okay? So if you're wanting to be able to take photographs up close, you may find that the depth of field is very short at the same f-stop as compared to when you look at something further away. So here's another example here talking about with the distance. And you can see here the camera's set at f4, and when our subject's standing at 5 foot away, the depth of field is very small. It's maybe like from 5 to 6 feet when taking the picture. But if we back the subject up to 10 feet, now we have everything from maybe, let's say, 7 feet all the way out to about 16 feet is going to be sharp in the picture. And then if we move the subject even further away, out to 15 feet, now we have everything from just inside 10 feet all the way out to 35 feet that's going to appear in focus at that same aperture. So the further away your subject is, the more likely everything's going to be sharp in the picture. The closer it is, the less likely everything is going to be sharp within the pictures themselves. Okay, so here's one more example. And in this example, you can see the coins. They're spaced at the same distance away. And in the top picture, you can see that we're focused on the coin in the front, very close to the camera. And in the background, the floor, the bottom of the picture, you can see that it quickly goes out of focus in the distance. Okay? In the one at the bottom, we're focused on the coin in the back. And now we can see that there's more of the background sharp in the picture and just a little bit of the foreground is out of focus within the picture. More things are sharp the closer, more things are sharp the further away you are from your subject. So now here's variable number 3, talk about the focal length of lens. And just basically what we're talking about is in focal length is the amount of things that we see within the view of our camera. Okay, as we increase that focal length, okay, the depth of field will decrease. So if we're using like a wide angle lens, which would be like maybe a 15 millimeter focal length lens, it's going to have a greater amount of depth of field. More things are going to be sharp than a 250 millimeter lens, which is a telephoto lens, where it kind of zooms in on our subject. Less in the background is going to be sharp with the 250 millimeter lens. So here's another example, just talking about with our subjects here. So if you're using a wide angle lens, more things are going to be sharp within the picture. If you're using a longer telephoto lens, less things are going to be sharp within our pictures. Here's an example with the lenses themselves. So in this example, you can see the 200 millimeter, well, this is a big 200 millimeter lens that you see at the top there. This is kind of the kind of lens that you would see sports photographers using on the sideline of football games or baseball games, taking pictures from there. And you may have seen some photographs in publications where the athlete is really sharp in the photograph, but the background is really blurry behind. And the reason for that is that they're using these long telephoto lenses to be able to bring their subject in closer and fill the frame more so, and they have shallower depth of field in the pictures. Okay. In the middle, the 85 millimeter lens, still a little bit on the longer side, but still not as long as the 200, and we can see that the area of sharpness is larger within the picture. The next one is the 50 millimeter, which is going to be even wider angle view, and more things you can see are sharp within the pictures. Here's another example using a ruler, or actually a meter stick, more technically here. Showing the example with using a telephoto lens, a long lens, you can see that there's really a small area in the picture here that's sharp of the ruler. But if we use more of a wide angle lens or a short lens, you'll see that that distance is greater overall. Okay. You see the change in the angle of view as well, because the telephoto zooms in, whereas the wide angle shows more of everything that's going on in the picture. Now, some lenses may have different apertures. Okay, in some cases, the lenses that you may have may only have a minimum of like f4 or f5.6 as the widest open aperture for your camera lens. But there are some lenses that are made to be faster or to have wider open apertures to let more light through. In those cases, you may find certain lenses, like for our cameras in the example here, the 55 millimeter lenses, we can find lenses that may have an aperture, widest aperture of f2, or we can even find some that may go all the way out to f1.2. The advantage being 1.2 is going to let 4 times as much light through as the f2 lens, which means we can use faster and faster shutter speeds for the same exposure time. Okay. Now, you can usually see these settings on your camera lens, both on a consumer camera as well as the DSLRs. Usually they're written on the front of the lens. You may see actually 2 numbers if you're using a zoom lens, in that it says that you may have widest open aperture at f4 when it's at 28 millimeters, and aperture of 5.6 when the zoom is set to 90 millimeters. Okay. And the reason for that is that as you use that zoom, you're changing the optics of the lens and kind of zooming out a little bit. Those glass lenses are moving away a little bit from the sensor, and so it's cutting down some of the light that's getting to the camera sensor itself. So as you go to the telephoto, you'll find that that widest open aperture will change overall. So again, thinking about those 3 things that we're using for doing our depth of field, we can use our aperture, we can use the distance we are away from our subject, and we can use the type of lens, telephoto or wide angle, is going to change the amount of depth of field that we're going to have in our photos. So when we're using these in combination with our shutter speed and our aperture, we can see how it can be able to change our photographs and how they look. In the example here, you can see how the flower at f11, we can see the flower very clearly, but we can also see a lot of things going on in the background as well, which can be really distracting. In the picture on the right, with the shallow depth of field, we see the flower clearly, but the background has become soft and less important within the picture. We can use these tools to be able to make our photographs be more creative, and we can do some really fun things with the depth of field. Here's an example a little bit more of a shallow depth of field, close-up photograph by Abelardo Morel, and you can see the horse's eye very clearly, but you can also see the subject in the background, but they're out of focus within the picture. Here's another example from him, and this one's kind of interesting, using the glasses as a lens as well to be able to create this change of focus. And in a way, if you look at it, the glasses are like wide angle lenses. We can see more within the pictures through the glasses, so more things are sharp within the picture, whereas the regular camera lens, we can see that the background and our subject is out of focus. Here's another example here where you can see everything is really sharp within the photograph. You can see the detail in the bridge. You can see the detail and the emotion in our subjects in the foreground here.